Hello, and welcome to the Bible, a crash course. Now, if you're familiar at all with the Bible, you know that it can be a bit of a daunting read, consisting as it does of 66 books composed by many different authors spanning a time period of centuries and centuries. And even if you've read the whole thing before, it can be tricky to hold the entire story in your head. So the aim of this short video is to present you with a quick overview of what's in the Bible and where the different books fit in its storyline. Two caveats before we start. One, because this is a summary, I'll be skimming and will leave a lot out. Make sure you fill in the gaps in your own reading. Two, don't take my word for it that this is what the Bible is about. Rather, use this as a jumping off point. So, let's begin. In the beginning, there was nothing. Then God spoke and created everything, and it was good. Creation culminated in the making of man and woman in God's image, which was very good. God told them to multiply and exercise dominion over the world. They also had to listen to and obey God. If they didn't, they would die. Unfortunately, they decided to disobey and sin against God, so God cut them off from life and banished them from his garden. This event is what we call the fall. It's a good thing the story doesn't end there. In God's judgments upon the man and the woman, he promised that one of the woman's offspring would be the serpent crusher, the one who would reverse the fall's effects and do away with sin. The rest of the Bible anticipates the coming of this person. So the first man and the first woman started a family who went on to have their own families. The problem is, although some of their offspring walked with God, many did not. By the time of Noah, mankind had become so corrupt, God in his justice decided to destroy them with a flood and start over with Noah and his family. Then God promised never again to destroy the world. However, humans continued to disobey and sin against God, so God continued to judge them for it. It was clear that if humanity's corruption and sinfulness was to be dealt with, men and women couldn't do it themselves. God had to step in. So God put his plan into motion. He came to one of Noah's descendants, a man named Abraham, and promised him three things: land, offspring, and blessing. The rest of the Bible shows how God fulfills those promises. Abraham's descendants became the great nation of Israel. It seemed like God's promise of offspring had been partially fulfilled. But what of his promise of land? At the beginning of the book of Exodus, the Israelites were slaves under a cruel and domineering Pharaoh. But God freed them through many signs and wonders. Under Moses, God led his people into the desert to worship him. He gave them his law, a guide to how the Israelites were to live as his people. However, the Israelites had a problem. How could they, as sinful people, ever even approach a sinless, holy God, let alone dwell with him? God's answer was the tabernacle or tent, and a sacrificial system that enabled sinners to make up for their sins through the blood of animals. This allowed the Israelites to come into God's presence and have God live among them. But despite God's repeated grace and mercy, the Israelites rejected him. The final straw came when they reached the edge of the promised land and refused to go in. So God judged them for their sinfulness and caused them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation died. After this, Moses led the Israelites to the edge of the promised land again. He exhorted them to honor and obey the Lord, otherwise God would curse them. Then he died. Joshua, Moses' successor, led the nation into the land, and as promised, God was with them each step of the way, giving them victory in battle. So Israel settled in the land, and it seemed like God's promise had been fulfilled. However, the people quickly forgot about God. They sinned and turned to idols, so God gave them over to their enemies. Then they cried out to him, and he delivered them by raising up a judge or leader. But once everything was fine again, the Israelites turned back to idolatry. Incidentally, it was during the time of the judges that King David's great-grandparents met and married. The final judge, Samuel, was petitioned by the people for a king. The Israelites wanted one so that they could be like the nations around them. They were, in effect, rejecting God. But God did as they asked and gave them King Saul. At first, it looked like Saul would be a good king who would rule the people under God. But then he turned against God. So God turned against him. God sent Samuel to anoint David king. This is the David who wrote most of the Psalms. When David eventually took the throne, he ushered in an era of peace and prosperity. It seemed as if all of God's promises had been fulfilled. But God had more in store. He promised to establish David's line. David would never lack a son to sit on his throne, and his kingdom would endure forever. However, even King David couldn't overcome the problem of human sin. He was a murderer and an adulterer, and his actions destroyed the lives of many. So God's people looked forward to the one from among David's descendants who would deal with sin once and for all. When David died, his son became king. Solomon was known for his wealth and wisdom, both God-given. He is said to have written Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. It seemed like he was the one the people had been expecting. However, towards the end of his life, Solomon turned to idols because his many lovers led him astray. In response, God split his great kingdom in half, into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The kings of Israel did not worship God the way they should have, and their dynasties were mostly short-lived, with violent ends. In comparison, the kingship of Judah passed from father to son through David's line, even though not all of them served God. Because of their wickedness, God caused the kingdom of Israel to be conquered by the Assyrians. Judah remained for a bit longer, however it too was decimated by the Babylonians. The prophets warned that this would happen. God would judge the people for their sin. However, the prophets also spoke of the fulfillment of God's promises, despite his people's sin. They spoke of God's chosen king who would come and solve this problem once and for all. The people of Judah remained in exile for 70 years, until 539 BC when Cyrus of Persia conquered the Babylonians and freed the Jews. Interestingly, not everyone decided to return home. Some, like Mordecai and Esther, remained behind. The returned exiles recommitted themselves to God. However, they continued to struggle to live God's way and were rebuked by the prophets. This is where the Old Testament ends. Now, if you've been paying attention, you notice that I've said nothing about Job. That's because it's not clear who wrote the book, when it was written, and where it fits into Israel's history. God was silent for almost 400 years. Lots of things happened, though. Empires rose and fell, but the Jewish nation endured, though mostly subjected to foreign rule. And then, God spoke once more. Through John the Baptist, the last and greatest prophet. His job was to prepare God's people for God's king, the one from David's line who would rule forever, Jesus. However, Jesus defied expectations. He was born in humble and scandalous circumstances, and was constantly on the run from people who wished to kill him. Furthermore, his ministry divided people. Some believed, but others reviled him for his teachings. The thing is, Jesus wasn't just another prophet or king. He claimed to have the authority of God because he was God. He was a king, but he was a king who came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many in order to rescue the people from their problem of sin. The people eventually crucified him. For those who truly believed, this was devastating. It looked like God's plan had failed. Yet, in fact, Jesus became the perfect sacrifice for sins, one who was completely like us, who was able to stand in our place and take the punishment we deserved. And God raised Jesus to life again, demonstrating that he had conquered death once and for all, and, bearing the sins of the world, reversed the fall's curse. Now all who submit themselves to Jesus' rule can enjoy forgiveness of sins and eternal life with their Creator. Jesus charged his followers to tell this good news to the world. Then he ascended to heaven, promising that one day he would return and bring the complete fulfillment of God's promises. However, he did not leave his followers alone. He gave them his Spirit to act as a guarantee of better things to come, to transform their lives, and to help them preach his good news to the world. So the good news spread, starting first in Jerusalem, Israel's capital, extending to what used to be David's kingdom, reaching out to non-Jewish people, then to other parts of Europe, and finally to what was considered at the time to be the end of the known world, Rome, the heart of the Roman Empire. Much of the book of Acts follows the Apostle Paul's ministry. Paul planted many churches and was the author of most of the letters in the New Testament. Other letters were written by the other apostles and leaders in the early church. The purpose of these letters were to encourage the early Christians to stand firm and put God first, to clarify various aspects of the gospel, and to provide instruction on how Christians ought to live as God's people. The Bible ends with John's vision of God's judgment and mercy upon the world, culminating in the defeat of God's enemies, the destruction of the old creation, and the establishment of the new. Here God's promises will finally be fulfilled. His chosen people, many in number, will dwell with him in his place, enjoying his blessings of forgiveness of sins and eternal life, and worshipping the eternal King, Jesus. The end of the beginning. Thank you for watching.